Now, I'm going to tell you for a moment a story of two New Yorkers, one from Brooklyn, one from Queens, both of whom are facing criminal indictments. Both are accused of taking cash from foreign governments. Both are accused of enriching themselves while in office. One of them is the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. The other is Donald Trump. Today, the FBI formally announced 5 criminal counts against Adams, including 2 counts of solicitation of contributions by a foreign national, as well as wire fraud and bribery.
Mayor Adams engaged in a long-running conspiracy in which he solicited and knowingly accepted illegal campaign contributions from foreign donors and corporations. As we allege, Mayor Adams took these contributions even though he knew they were illegal.
Now, it's an allegation that Trump is facing as well about the possibility that he took a $10 million illegal cash contribution from Egypt around his 2016 presidential campaign. Like Trump, since Adams took office in 2022, his administration has been caught up in several federal investigations. In a statement late last night, Adams even sounded like Trump when he denied the allegation, saying it was a result of him standing up for the people of New York.
I always knew that if I stood my ground for all of you, that I would be a target. And a target I became. For months, leaks and rumors have been aimed at me in an attempt to undermine my credibility and paint me as guilty. Enough. I will fight these injustices with every ounce of my strength and my spirit.
And given all the similarities, one might wonder if you could imagine a world where Adams decides to make a run for president as a Republican, of course. I mean, why not? He would meet all the same standards as the party's present nominee, potential felon, potential bribe taker, having enriched himself in office. In fact, according to the 57-page indictment, that very idea pops up as a motivating factor for one of the foreign nationals allegedly making an illegal contribution to the mayor's pockets. The belief that Adams might one day be the president of the United States. Adams will be arraigned tomorrow in a federal courtroom in the city he serves. Joining me now is Catherine Christian, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst, and the Reverend Al Sharpton, president of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation. Thank you both for being here. Catherine, I want to go to you first because something popped into my head just as I was thinking through this, and as I was literally, I'm talking and I'm thinking at the same time. Could not the mayor appeal these allegations on the basis that the Supreme Court has said that a political figure can simply take a gratuity? And if he characterizes it as a gratuity that was paid to him after he did the thing that the briber wanted, there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, the Southern District, yeah, you're talking about the McDonald case. I'm certain that the Southern District Attorney's Office have made sure that this indictment conforms with that decision, that this alleged gifts were done in exchange for Mayor Adams and also borough president, when he was the borough president of Brooklyn, doing official action on their behalf, like getting the fire department to approve, even though the building didn't pass a fire inspection, to build the Turkish consulate. So I'm pretty certain that the Southern District would not have charged bribery if they not believe that they had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that conforms with that Supreme Court decision.
Rev, this, I have to say, this behavior sounds a lot like the stuff Trump would do. Put some money in some, get some money here, get some money there, do a little bribing, a little, using money to grease the wheels.
Well, we're going to see a trial. I mean, clearly, there are many of us very concerned. Let me say this. I think Mayor Adams had done a job that many of us felt was effective, that he didn't get credit for. Crime was down, city was moving forward, and now hit with this. And what we're concerned about is the standard. He should not be judged by anything but the trial. He should not be removed. They didn't remove Senator Menendez. They let him perform. And what we're saying is it must be one set of rules. I do not believe Damon Williams is someone that is the enemy of the interests of people who brought the indictment. I do not feel that Eric Adams, who I've known for many years, is just a career criminal. And so I think that we need to let that play out. A lot of us talk about meeting this weekend to take a position, but we're clearly not calling on them to be removed. By what standard? We've seen other people indicted, they were not removed. And that would send a signal that maybe this is more political than it is dealing with the merits of the case, which we've not determined one way or another in our review. We have our lawyers in National Action Network looking at that.
Well, I mean, let's talk about it, because here's Donald Trump saying that he thinks, he's asked whether he thinks Mayor Adams should resign. He makes it political.
I don't know the mayor well, but he's been fairly generous to me in his statements for a while. I thought you had the worst mayor ever that we had prior to him. I will say this. I watched about a year ago when he talked about how the illegal migrants are hurting our city and the federal government should pay us and we shouldn't have to take them. And I said, you know what? He'll be indicted within a year. And I was exactly right. Because that's what we have. We have people that use the Justice Department and the FBI at levels that have never been seen before.
And Catherine, that has already become a right-wing talking point. MAGA folks are now claiming that he's only being indicted, Eric Adams, because he criticized the Biden-Harris immigration policy, echoing Trump. But here's the challenge that I have with that, Catherine. Here are the people that the Justice Department has gone after just in the last year or so. Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, convicted. Hunter Biden, president's son, convicted. Representative Henry Cuellar, Democrat, indicted, and Mayor Eric Adams. So they're going after a lot of Democrats for a Justice Department that's trying to weaponize itself against Democrats.
That's correct. And U.S. Attorney Williams is a man whose reputation is one of integrity and high ethics, that he's not political, that he wouldn't just, go after the mayor of New York because the quote Biden DOJ was upset because the mayor was upset about immigration. So this is, as the Reverend Al said, this is an indictment. It is an accusation. It is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's still, these allegations have to be proven in court. And criminal defense attorneys normally will say this indictment is just a piece of paper, which is true. It's a very factually detailed indictment that has very serious charges. It's clear from when you read it that there are clearly several people who probably are cooperating or confidential sources against the mayor. That, again, doesn't mean that that's proof beyond reasonable doubt. But these are very serious charges. Wire fraud is 20 years if he was convicted, the maximum.
Yeah, no, it's serious charges. I mean, as faces Trump. And I think, to Reverend Sharpton's point, they should be judged equally. And Donald Trump should not skate on things that Mayor Adams has to pay for. I want to, before we go, let you comment, Rev, on Rudy Giuliani being disbarred in D.C. for his role in trying to steal the 2020 election.
I think that is something that we've seen clearly coming. What Rudy Giuliani has done, certainly you could not have him as an officer of the court with the kinds of things that we have known in terms of evidence. He deserves his day in court, but he deserves a day in court. And I really hope that we don't see Donald Trump and others try and weaponize what has happened to Democrats to say, therefore, that Donald Trump is a victim or a target of someone. Donald Trump was convicted of crimes. He is a felon. And if I was facing a court date, I would not want a 34-count felon trying to speak on my behalf. I think that Donald Trump needs to stay out of this and let the courts handle it. And I think we need to see that the city keeps moving as it was moving under Eric's administration.
I will note that if he was to be removed, Jumaane Williams would become the mayor, just based on the way the succession works in the state of New York. We can talk about that at another time. He's a very, very progressive brother, but we will get into that another time. Catherine Christian, thank you so much. Rev Al is going to stick with us.